Hello! What happens when a therapy model starts believing its own story? It becomes religion. The whole IFS ontology can be seen as an elaborate hallucination about the nature of our mind. From parts as literal beings inside our heads to the self who is like a particle of God in each one of us, to entities that lurk in the shadows and they can possess you and enter your astral whatever at certain points. IFS seriously ventures into areas like spirituality, shamanism, and even demonology. For something that tries to be so scientific and to have a scientific basis, IFS shoots high above their scientific basis. Some people say that this is actually a strength and it's needed because this is what makes the model very powerful. But my take is different. It's not only not needed, it can actually harm the vulnerable people it's supposed to help. In this episode, I will be talking about IFS, its assumptions, and how can we make sense about what exactly is going on with this therapy model, and is it even worth paying attention to it? I am Benjamin, and welcome to the Florine Benjamin Show. IFS therapy ontology is built on several logical errors. IFS doesn't make just one mistake. It stacks several logical errors. It turns emotional states into inner beings. That's called category error. Mistakes subjective experience for objective structure. That's going from phenomenology to ontology. And interprets therapeutic relief as a proof of metaphysics, which is a confirmation bias. If IFS were a person, it would be that friend who tells you a beautiful symbolic story about their inner world and then gets angry when you remind him that's just a story, it's not a structure of reality. What IFS does is they say if parts language helped someone, that means parts are literal inner beings that live inside you. If calling a calm state self and trying to go there helps people, that means self is a particle of God that is in each one of us. If panic reduces after an entity expelling ritual that they do, it means that entities must be real things and spirits that possess you since millennia, and that means they have agency, these beings. That's what basically IFS does. And I think one of the reasons why we need to be talking about this is because of the difference between a model and the reality. Even now when I'm talking, when I'm trying to describe these phenomena, these therapies, this is not reality. This is a description. This is a model. It's like I'm offering you a map through which you can see for yourself if it does make sense, if you get to the same conclusions or the same experience as I have. And that basically happens every time when someone uses language. Let's not confuse first a map of reality or a model to reality. Taking that into consideration, a model has its advantages, and one of them is that it simplifies. So model is a tool, and reality is the thing that the tool points you to. All this works until the model starts to believe its own stories, basically. And that's what I believe IFS does. So what are the main components of the IFS therapy? There are three important things that happens in IFS therapy. One of them are the parts language, the second one is the self, and the third one is the entities. So let me start with the parts, the inner beings that are not really inner beings. This is not the first therapeutic model or psychological therapy that talks about parts. I mean, the first person that comes to my mind that talked about subpersonalities and dissociation, it was Pierre Janet. He was a psychologist from 1890s until 1920s. Then Freud, with his psychoanalysis, he talked about ego, superego, internal conflicts. Between the 1940s and 1970s, we had ego state therapy from Paul Federn, John and Helen Watkins. We have the Moreno psychodrama, the inner child therapies, all these therapies that work with the inner. These are all therapies that worked with similar concepts and similar ideas as parts. Why do these therapies use parts anyway? Do they make any sense? Yes, they actually do make sense, because externalization, imagining that your shame, your fear, your terror is an inner child, that's a lot easier to digest. And it actually helps with some separation between the feeling and the one who observes the feeling. It creates some space to hold the emotion. So it makes sense. Also, the personification helps organize chaos, because if you give some qualities to the fear or the shame, then it's a lot easier to work with it. Imaginary dialogue also activates memory reconsolidation. That being said, when IFS goes from the let's use this metaphor to represent your emotions to these emotions are inner beings with their own emotions and agenda and everything, it's like saying that there are roles you play in life, like the parent, the worker, the friend, are separate people who live inside you. So why is the inner beings metaphor wrong? It is wrong because parts are processes that happen inside a being that we are. It is a pattern. You are the system that produces, contains, and integrates these patterns. We are a self-regulating, continuous, boundary-maintaining organism that experiences processes that we call emotions, thoughts, or you can call them parts. A part is an emotional sub-process that depends entirely on the organism and by extension the environment in which it arises, basically. IFS confuses these sub-processes with separate beings. That's a category error. From a Buddhist perspective, calling parts inner beings is simply ignorance, in the classical sense of mistaking certain mental patterns for actual entities or beings. Buddhism says these are conditioned processes, not people. IFS reifies them, and that reification is the exact error which we have talked about. IFS is not only reifying these as being beings, but it also builds an entire ecosystem on top of these parts. Self, the particle of God. IFS says that self is undamageable, indestructible essence of who we are, a drop of the ocean in each one of us. What is the good part about this self? Well, it does give you a pillar, some scaffolding. When you went through a lot of pain, a lot of shame, a lot of trauma, when you experienced horrible things, the idea that in your essence you are pure and nothing can damage you is empowering. As an idea, as a concept, is helpful. Even during therapy, the therapist's co-regulation calms the nervous system, and the self-language, this self they talk about, cues a regulated state. The problem with the self is the same as with the parts, is that it's a state that happens inside us. It's not an essence. If this self would be an essence or something permanent, then we will always experience that. Doesn't that make sense? But we don't always experience this calm, this, of course, the IFS therapists and the masters in IFS, they say they are always in self, whatever that is, but that doesn't mean that they actually are in that. They try to be. And one reason why they have 100,000 questions and seminars about how do you discern between a self and a self-like part. That's why this seminary exists, because apparently it's not that easy to say that, okay, because he's calm, he's in God mode. In Buddhist terms, self-energy is a conditioned mind free of hindrances. When these 5 disturbances are present, like sensual craving, ill will, restlessness or anxiety, dullness or doubt, the mind naturally displays clarity, compassion, and calm. Again, this is not a self, this is a temporary clearing. IFS self-energy is just a momentary, wholesome, non-reactive mind state. It's not an inherent essence of anything. Buddhism would say that you're mistaking a clean window for an eternal soul. That is what Buddhism will call also clinging. And now we're going to entities. During my LSD experience and the fallout from that, I did have some encounters with what some would call entities. And trying to make sense of this, I of course went to seek help, and one of the help that I received is through IFS. In one of my sessions with this psychologist and psychotherapist, which was a very skill trained and maybe even a lead trainer in IFS world. And during my session, I asked this guy, because he was trying to help me get rid of these entities. I asked him, so what about this entity, if he's feeding on my fears, like they say, who is feeding on his fears? If I try to get rid of him because I've done some contract with this thing and he's doing things to me, then who allows that, and what's the ecosystem in the back of this? Like, how does this look, Well, to that, my therapist answered that, why don't you want to get rid of him? And then, of course, I ended this relationship and therapy sessions. And looking back, I tried to understand what was going on there, because for me, it didn't really make sense. But then I realized what happened. You don't need any entities or separate beings that feed on people's fears to explain people's emotions. There is already literature, there are scientific studies that show that when people experience extreme emotions, the mind fragments and stores these emotions in separate places. And under certain circumstances, when these emotions surface, they can take the form of images, sounds, voices that people would interpret and say that they are having these entities and possessions or whatever they call them. But then if the emotion, the underlying emotion is integrated, surprise, surprise, the entity also disappears, or even if it doesn't bother you in any other way anymore. This creates another problem, because for some people, this idea that we don't work with metaphors, but we actually believe that these entities exist, creates more suffering than helps them, because it removes the agency, it removes the inner power, and it creates fear, it creates rituals that people have to start doing lights, candles, prayers to stay away from bad spirits and all these things. They don't really trust themselves anymore, because if this thing is external to them, is not a fragment of their mind, then they have no control. Returning to my what I realized talking with this psychotherapist is that When I asked him what's the architecture behind this world that he's trying to send this entity to, the reason why he didn't answer and redirected me, it was because he didn't really have any answer. IFS is supposed to be a psychological, scientific-based modality that people use. It isn't supposed to be like a metaphysical, spirituality, shamanic, demonology tool for exorcism. If you keep IFS under scientific, psychological, therapeutic grounding, then you cannot really answer that question. What are these beings? Who are they? Why are they having agency? What's the ecosystem in which they exist? Who are haunting them? Okay, if these entities haunt me, who allowed them to make a contract with me when I was a child? Or whatever they say, these IFS therapists, that when you're small and in fear, you contract, these entities come to you and you contract them as a help then, and then you're stuck with them, they feed on you. And I even heard some guy talking, one important people in IFS, that he saw that he was speaking with someone that told him there are cemeteries in which these beings, intergalactic beings, are feeding on fear and on people. This is not helping people, okay? This is creating another useless complication on top of suffering of people. You're a lot better off if you're encountering these emotions, strong emotions in you, to try do grounding, try to do HTMA, like regulate your mineral system, try to stay scientifically based, try to use other tools that will not increase your fear and increase your lack of agency. All this being said, you might have the impression that I believe IFS is totally useless. Well, if that's your impression, that's not actually what I believe. I do believe this IFS therapy is good in a lot of ways. They tap into what actually works in relieving suffering, in helping people be more present, in helping people connect with their emotions, distance from their intensity sometimes. In my view, IFS can keep the tools, keep the imagery, keep the talk about metaphors and the parts and the entities maybe as symbols of fragmented pain, emotions, and drop the metaphysics, drop the entities as having agency, the parts inner beings, the self as an eternal soul, the Richard Schwartz received the therapy from guides, and all these things. This is not helping. So what helps are the tools, parts as working metaphors, entities as dissociated fear clusters, self as a regulated state, physiology, boundaries, and real-world context. Integrate with modern trauma science and neurobiology. You don't need all this. So that's what I believe mostly about IFS, and I hope by watching this video you got a better understanding of what's going under the hood with all this IFS, and what's good, what's bad and ugly about it. No matter what you believe about this, I hope love, peace and calm find you. Before you go, if you like this episode, feel free to watch this next episode. Until next time, Benjamin.